My name is Jana Monroe. I was an FBI agent for over 20 years. I specialized in interviewing and profiling killers and serial killers. This is how crime works. In conducting these interviews that is such high stakes, you get one shot. One of the serial killers that I had interviewed, he would be talking about what he did, his crimes, and it would be pretty heinous. Being a sociopath, he did not understand remorse, but I could appeal to their ego. So many of the serial killers that were sociopaths or psychopaths, they have no remorse. FBI profiling it's a structured process that integrates different elements: behavioral analysis, psychology, victimology, criminology, forensic evidence, and investigative techniques. It's a tool that narrows down who and what you're looking for through sign of behaviors, and they have an offender that they want to elicit a confession. It's how to handle that, whether it's a soft approach, a harder approach, and they give the investigators that type of guidance. So my time that I spent in the behavioral science unit, which is now called the behavioral analysis unit, I worked on approximately 850 cases. So the behavioral analysis unit became involved with the Jeffery Dahmer case initially, although he was arrested by the local department in Wisconsin, but after they served a search warrant on his house and realized they had a bunch of different victims and body parts that belonged to different victims, they weren't sure what they were looking at or what they had, and they thought it was important to have some background on that before they conducted interviews. Initially, he was not speaking to investigators. So they brought all of the evidence and the arrest reports down to Quantico and spent about 7 hours with us at that point, just relating the crime, showing us the evidence, and us being able to come up with an interview strategy for that. But because of the way that some post-mortem activity that he had, where he severed heads and hands and had even put some of different body parts together, almost like with popsicle stick sort of a thing. I mean, that's very aberrant behavior. So you don't go in and just ask, well, why did you do that? So you've got to put together a whole strategy so that you can get around to that. What were you thinking at the time? And when did this start? Do you remember the first time that you had a fantasy like this? And Jeffrey Dahmer was involved in a lot of post-mortem activity and sexual activity after death. And so just asking how that happened. You don't wake up one day and just have all of these things. So was it something that started at childhood? Did he recognize it? Did he talk to anybody about it? How did it manifest? All of those types of questions I wanted to ask. Moving forward, after he was convicted and he was in prison, I had made an appointment to go and interview him. He was killed 2 days prior to the date I was going to be there. What we have learned is more common when you have a series of sexual assault or rape cases, that you start looking at where all the victims were. So I was working on a case. They were close to each other. They lived in a similar neighborhood, and then it kind of branched out a little bit, and they were all at a similar time frame. And none of the victims were killed, so we got statements from all of them, and there was a consistent statement about how the offender smelled. And he said, which actually it was a good smell. He had on cologne, and it smelled like he had just bathed. And when you look at profiling something like that, typically the offender starts out close to where he is comfortable. And then as he becomes more emboldened, he kind of moves out of that area a bit. And this fit that pattern exactly. What happened was the offender worked in a factory not too far from where he lived in this neighborhood, and he worked a night shift, but he got off at 2 a.m. and he would take a shower before going home. And when they had a search warrant of his locker of where he worked, they found men's cologne, which then they presented to the victims, and most of them could identify the cologne.
I'm Liz Merriweather, creator and executive producer of Hulu's new crime thriller, Furious.
And I'm Chitra Raghavan, a clinical psychologist, and I specialize in extreme violence. Revenge is a slow, cold poison that sits with you and that you plan, and it's an addictive emotion.
What the show dives into is a character who has felt both rage and revenge. She's investigating the murders of these men, but really she's investigating her own feelings about the violence that was committed against her.
I think it's true that you can be rageful and revengeful at the same time. It's something that we don't consider much. Rage is a reaction to being threatened or harmed.
I always want, in this show in particular, the audience to never get comfortable with a character and whether or not they're good or bad, or whether or not they forgive them or blame them. If something happened to you that changes your ability to deal with the world, at what point are you to blame for what you do?
The process for getting the FBI involved in a killer or serial killer case, because typically it's not federal violation, is for the local law enforcement to have exhausted all of their resources and send all of their materials to Quantico, which is where the profiling unit, the behavioral analysis unit, is located. Typically, FBI protocol is you have 2 agents when you're interviewing a killer. The ones that I interviewed, it was in an interview room, if you will, but there was a glass similar to like a plexiglass there, and you had some holes in it so that you could hear and you could speak to one another. And they were also shackled and usually handcuffed, and you had a guard or 2 in the room with you. At the time that I was conducting these interviews, I wanted to give eye contact, I wanted to be amenable, I wanted to be present, and it's really listening, professional listening, and it's hard to do that while you're writing also. So that was a lot of when I finished my interview with someone, I would go into another room and try to take as many notes as possible or record my own notes so that I got the accuracy. But the very important part of this was to make sure that I knew the case backward and forward, because I wanted to be able to catch him in a lie. I had an interview that I was anxious before going into, and the reason is it was a female, a mother, that we were suspicious that she was doing Munchausen by proxy. And what that is, it's in her case, she had just had her 5th child die, which is extremely unusual. And she had said that, she had bad luck. A couple of them were SIDS death, that's sudden instant death syndrome. So a baby dies in the crib. The others, there had been numerous hospital visits. And as hideous as it sounds, the syndrome is where the mother's looking for attention. She wants the attention on her. My partner and I both were very suspicious that it was her. And I think the more genuine that you can appear, the better the likelihood of getting some of the information that you want. I worked very closely with Bill Hagmaier, and we were collaborating on how to interview Ted Bundy. Well, Bill went ahead to Stark Prison and made that first initial contact, came back and told me that he did not want to speak to a female and he only wanted to speak with Bill. Special Agent Hagmaier went ahead and he conducted the interviews and was very successful in getting confessions from him. After Bill Hagmaier had conducted these interviews, he'd come to the office, we'd collaborate, make sure that the notes made sense so that we could give the facts to them, as Bundy had indicated, and some of them were able to actually locate the victims after all those years. He was then executed at Stark Prison. Another part that was very challenging and frustrating was in interviewing so many of these serial offenders. They committed some pretty hellacious crimes, and they were very casual about it. I would have to really listen to the words to realize, they're talking and describing in detail what they did. One of the things that's always stuck with me was so many of the serial killers that were sociopaths or psychopaths, they have no remorse. They have a flat affect of emotions. It was almost a chilling effect, kind of goosebumps, when he would be talking about what he did, his crimes. And it would be pretty heinous, pretty grisly, gruesome, right? But with a flat affect on their voice, no emotional response that you could detect at all. And yet was speaking about it like he was mowing a lawn or having a haircut or something. And that part was very disturbing, and I wanted to make sure that I didn't have a response. You're not going to get someone to open up to you, confess what they have done, and most of them are extremely intelligent, so they know what they have done is wrong, but they don't feel what they have done is wrong. So made sure that I didn't go like, ew, or or make any kind of a grimace or something, passing no physical signs of passing judgment on what they were telling me. Some of these serial killers, in my observation, were feigning remorse. And one of I think a great example, I've got a video of Edmund Kemper, who was a prolific serial killer, and he just happened to be in size. He's like 6'9" at the time, weighed over 300. So I mean, he's somebody that would stand out. Very, very intelligent, but being a sociopath, he did not understand remorse. And before one of the parole boards, he was trying to feign remorse, and one of it was matricide. His last victim was his mother. And I'm sure he had been told by psychiatrists that that's horrible, to kill one's mother. So he said, yeah, matricide is awful. And then he paused, and it was like he was trying to conjure up a tear. He was trying to make his eyes water, and he just couldn't accomplish that. There's all kinds of things that are indicators, not absolutes, of lying. There's nothing so standardized as that somebody's looking off to the right or somebody's looking off to the left. You have to talk to them enough to see what their normal pattern is. And then when you ask somebody, what's your name, what's your date of birth, those are questions that most people are at ease with, right? And then when you start getting into the ones that are more like, did you kill someone, or have you been in that house before, or that's when, if someone is lying, and especially when you're looking at the serial killers or killers, they tend to deviate from that pattern. And it might be a little blink, a little look down, a little look up. When people are lying, when you're making up a story in a vacuum, you're not looking for your memory. If you're looking at your memory, you can look straight ahead. Like, okay, that was last Tuesday. But then if you're thinking, oh, I don't want to tell them it was Tuesday, that was a week ago Thursday, there's going to be different changes. Some people have their subconsciously, they'll touch their nose or do this. Sometimes women play with their hair. That doesn't mean they're lying. If they're doing that in the initial part, that's just kind of their behavior. It's when they start doing something differently, when you're asking different questions. That's what you key in on. And it's a variety of things. I had one killer that I was interviewing. His hands were like this the entire time. And then when he started, I believe, fabricating things, he would do, instead of looking here or there, I think he was, tactically trying to just touch himself because he wanted to keep the eye contact. I think he knew enough that, if you break eye contact, they're going to think you're lying. But it's going to come out somewhere. And for him, it was in his hands. Because we all have that little hairs stand up. There's something that just doesn't seem right. There's a catch. And I think it's something that is very underestimated. And in law enforcement, at least initially, and it's officers and agents, we want facts. What experience taught me was not to ignore that and to go ahead and say, I don't know what it means right now, but I'm going to pay, this is a data point, and I'm going to pay attention to that. And I think our own bodies tell us a lot, but when you've been trained to kind of ignore that and only go with facts, that's when it's minimized, and I don't think it should be. One of the serial killers that I had interviewed, he had been apprehended and convicted of two. He did not confess to them, but he'd forensically been convicted. We had some unsolved that I was very suspicious that he was involved in. So I was interviewing him about those, and that's when his behavior changed. And it changed from him actually having pretty good eye contact to shifting in his chair a lot, and looking down a little bit. Again, these things are subtle. It's not real overt, like, aha. People would like to have that seem like it's something that anybody can detect, but it was something where he was visibly uncomfortable. The founding principles from the interviews of serial killers were the takeaways of motive and motivation. And what we learned was there was typically a very healthy or unhealthy fantasy life. And there was also, as the killers grew more confident, let's say, they killed somebody, nobody was even, suspicious of them. They were more emboldened at that. Like Bundy's a perfect example. He would pick the area where he was going to dispose of the body before he even selected the victim. The age-old question is, are, serial killers born or are they made? Nature, nurture? Yes, it's both. I totally agree with that. And the reason is when you look at data, you look at research, you will find people, siblings in the same family. One becomes a serial killer, the another becomes a doctor, another becomes an attorney. I know Bundy had said, well, he looked at pornography at an early age. I know a lot of people who did, and they didn't become prolific serial killers. There was a predictive model that we used called the triad, and that was if a child is exhibiting some of the behaviors, if they're a fire setter, enuresis, which means bedwetting after the age that you really should be, and then cruelty to animals, if they exhibited all three of those, the likelihood of them being a violent offender was much more probable.
The bedwetting, what's the reasoning or the thought behind that being?
The thought behind that was a lack of control. And when you look at a lot of the serial killers, one of the biggest components, more so than the sexual drive, is control. So I think that was the frustrating part of it, and the acting out was the other part of the triangle. You do have the triangle of behavior that they use for children. Also worked on a couple of cases where they were very graphic in art. They were artists, but the type of things they chose to draw were very violent and very graphic. And we're talking at age, 7, 8, 9 years old. The Oba Chandler serial killer case in Tampa, Florida is a unique one for me. I was a coordinator for the FBI in Tampa, and the Rogers family, it was a mother and Joan Rogers and her two daughters, Christy and Michelle, that lived in Ohio. And for the oldest daughter, who was 17, they had not been out of the state of Ohio. And so she wanted to go to Disney World in Orlando and then see the ocean. So they drove to Tampa. Unfortunately, they were killed, and it was a hideous death. They went missing on June 1st, 1989, and then their bodies were found floating on June 4th, 1989. And the way that the crime had been committed was that they all had cinder blocks, 55-pound cinder blocks, concrete. Their hands and feet were tied. The purpose of that, they were thrown into the water alive, was to weight them down. And what the killer underestimated was the buoyancy and gases of a dead body, and they ended up floating to the surface. So I became involved when the bodies were found. One of the other coordinators, Stan Jacobson, and I, we were not invited, but we went to the crime scene as they were fishing the bodies out of the water. They were in different locations, but close enough that we thought this must be the same thing going on. St. Petersburg Police Department had the jurisdiction on that. My initial impression in looking at the Rogers case was just real sadness. It was my first emotion on that. And then later, when I was actually helping the police department and we were just kind of going over some facts and whatnot, I found that the sad turned to mad. I got very angry because I really felt for them, and I felt, oh my God, for the husband, the father, he just lost his whole family. Fast forward, I was transferred shortly thereafter to Quantico to become a profiler. The investigators in St. Petersburg continued to investigate the case, but then it went cold. And it was such a heinous crime. So they asked for help from Quantico. So we looked at all of the evidence again, basically started from zero. Again, there's got to be a detail, there's got to be something that we missed. And there was a note, a handwritten note in cursive that was a part of the evidence. It was in the console of the rental car. And so my question was, who wrote that note? And they said, well, Joan Rogers. I said, well, how do we know? How do we know that? And there was silence. So what happened was the investigators went to Ohio, asked the husband/father, is this your wife or your daughter's handwriting? And he said, no, not at all. So that's when we came to the conclusion that that was an important element that had been overlooked, is that this handwriting must have belonged to the offender. So we blew the handwriting up and put it on numerous billboards. It had a phone number, said make sure that you contact, St. Petersburg PD or the Tampa FBI. And had quite a few calls, but there were 3, I believe, that all had the same name, and that was Oba Chandler. Oba's I'd never heard that name before, kind of unique. I think this case, it was the profiling training, in addition to the regular FBI training. Don't overlook any little piece of evidence. In this case, it was the handwriting. That was your regular FBI work. But I think the behavioral part of it that was some assistance was the afterwards then in getting search warrants and surveilling the suspect, Oberchandler. So the surveillance was conducted by the local law enforcement in the Tampa area. He was ultimately arrested, and when he was being interviewed, there was some information, not that he confessed to this, but led investigators to some other women he had abducted and tried to kill and was not successful. And then there was a homicide subsequent to the Rogers that he was suspected of being the offender in. Because I had the opportunity to be involved from the beginning, they were also gracious enough and let us know when he was apprehended and then when he was executed. There's quite a few cases that would have no name recognition, but one of them that stands out is the Susan Smith case. And that's a case where she had claimed she had two little boys that were in car seats in the back seat of her car, and she had claimed that she had been abducted by an African-American male, and he drove off with the car with the two little boys in it. We went to help on that one, and it was like, okay, this makes no sense of where it occurred, and it was predominantly a Caucasian area, so a black male in that area somebody might have seen, they might have seen a car driving. Plus, it made no sense as to why, if somebody's going to carjack, they'd take the responsibility of an infant and a baby in the backseat of a car if that was not their motivation. And the issue where we had to handle it very sensitively is that the community considered her an excellent mom. It was a small area, so she was known. And so there was that sentiment that you didn't want to come in and be the bad guy, but we were suspicious initially because of what I just mentioned. And as it ended up, she had pushed the car into a body of water and actually drowned her children. One of the first successful profiling cases would have been the Wayne Williams case, the Atlanta child murders, and that one was very high profile and extremely alarming. It was occurring in the black community of Atlanta, and there seemed to be no eyewitnesses from the neighborhood. There was nobody that was standing out that they could say, we saw this strange person or this person was, out of the ordinary here, which made it unusual. So Special Agent in Charge, SAC, John Glover, was the first African-American SAC, and he was in the Atlanta division, and he offered any help that the FBI could give investigators when they were investigating the Wayne Williams case, and that was our laboratory and the profilers. The profiling unit was very helpful in the Wayne Williams case was because the neighbors and community didn't see anything out of the ordinary because the suspect ended up being African American, and that's very unusual. Serial killers tend to be white, but Wayne Williams lived in that area and he did not stand out. I joined the behavioral profiling unit in 1985. When I hired on, there were 12 of us in the unit, and we were the behavioral science unit. So the behavioral science unit training was an 18-month program, but it was 18 months while doing on-the-job training. So we continued to work. We ended up looking at crime scenes, went along for a crime scene ride, if you will, with NYPD. And then there were certain videos or films that we would watch of John Wayne Gacy, Edmund Kemper, Ted Bundy. It would be ones for specific reasons, like, okay, here, look at how he's looking, what he's doing. This is where we think he's lying, and this is why. And this is how you would be able to confer this to, what we had in evidence already. The skill sets that are valuable, and of course they're enhanced by the training, are number one, knowing how to interview to begin with, and understanding an approach, and being an excellent listener. When you're interviewing, none of it's about you. And it's about the person that you're trying to elicit information from. The behavioral analysis unit, it works as a group think tank kind of methodology, if you will. And what that means is, like I said, there were 12 of us when I was there, and everybody working on different cases, and all of us brought something different to the table. Typically, there were like 3 or 4, and on some really significant cases, we had, 5, 6, 7 of us. And again, we brought in different skill sets, we brought in different experience levels. Initially, The behavioral science unit was in the basement. It was never intended to be office space. It was supposed to be J. Edgar Hoover's bomb shelter in case of bombing, but they didn't know where to put us, and so that's where we were. But it started off like that, looking just at the behaviors to be able to help with forensics, and then morphed or transitioned into an actual unit where it was the serial killer research was part of the initial part is getting all the interviews of the serial killers to look for that information, to motivation, background, those sorts of things. I think by the general agent population, their perspective was, what do those people do? And because we were located in a basement, it even exacerbated that. We would do things like go to the medical examiner's office, or the coroner, depending what they had in that area, and we'd watch autopsies. And it was very, very valuable to see how an autopsy was performed, what the medical examiner came up with. So the serial killer interviews, I learned from each and every one of them, but none of them were the same. It's like, human beings, there's going to be some differences. But one of the things that was the same for me, being on the interview side of it, was making sure that I could appeal to their ego. Everybody has an ego, but some are larger than others. But when I'm interviewing them, the FBI could not offer them anything. We couldn't offer a stay of execution. We couldn't offer better food, a transfer to a different prison. So, why? What's their motivation for talking to us? And what we used was that appeal to the ego, something to the effect of, well, you were very successful at this. And in fact, law enforcement never apprehended you. You turned yourself in, or it took years. You were so efficient at that. Could we learn from you? And the other, if you could ascertain from them that maybe they were remorseful, or at least were pretending to be remorseful, you could say something like, I'm sure you don't want other men to follow in your footsteps. So how can you help us, law enforcement, help other people that might have a tendency towards violent crime? The hardest part of the job was not knowing how cases ended. It was, I don't even want to call that hard. I guess it was just frustrating, because I know most of us really did pour our heart and soul into this. You're looking at, the victims can't speak on this. And it was frustrating sometimes to see the name recognition with certain prolific serial killers, and nobody knew who the victim was. It's not just the victim, it's her family, her spouse, people in the community, whatever she did. So there's a lot of people that are negatively impacted. The movie, The Silence of the Lambs, a large part of it was filmed at Quantico. So the whole cast and crew came down to do the filming there. I was selected to work with Jodie Foster because I was the only female in the unit. And so it was like I was Clarice Starling to her. So we went over what an agent, and especially a new agent like that, what her demeanor would be like, how she would be in interviewing somebody as diabolical as the fictitious Dr. Hannibal Lecter. We sat in my office, and she had the script and would say, at this part, they say, Clarice says this or says that. And she would ask me, would a real agent say that or not? And I'd either say yes or no, I think a response like this might be better, or they never say anything like that. I had no influence, but she did, and she was actually able to get some of the verbiage changed, some of the script changed. I think the scene of where she's walking down the hall to the prison cell where she's going to speak to Dr. Hannibal Lecter was very realistic, and it brought back memories to me, because being the only woman walking down that aisle, you get hoots and hollers and, that kind of stuff that you don't want to react to, right? And I think Jodie Foster did an excellent job. She didn't look terrified, but she looked anxious and she looked nervous, because it is awkward, it is uncomfortable. And in fact, the file folder that she used in that was my file folder. That was an actual one that I'd had a case on. Obviously, the notes were, blank. My response to the final depiction in the film, I had to get out of FBI mode. So it's entertainment. So you can't watch somebody type all day long. That's boring. I loved it. And I think they did an excellent job. I think the series Mindhunter, which is based on John Douglas's book by the same name, is very accurate for the profiling and for the unit. And I think they depicted the interview process and how they responded to cases. I think that was pretty accurate. So in looking at the basement where the offices were located, that's very accurate. If you're talking about Criminal Minds and a bunch of other shows, Quantico, I haven't really watched too many others looking at bloody, battered bodies all day long. So I did not choose for a while to look at that for my entertainment. And I think there's a genuine fascination, and it seems to be more so among women than men, for the true crime piece. And I think a lot of that has to do with security. And women wanting to feel secure and wanting to be able to identify something, and then also for the entertainment value of it. But I think overall, they do a good job. I wrestle with there being so much name notoriety to serial killers, again, and not victims, but I understand why that is. Unlike how it is portrayed oftentimes in the media and in the entertainment world, the FBI did have finite resources. And so it was a bit frustrating when you looked at budget constraints, because not only in the behavioral science unit, but in everything else. So my first office in Albuquerque, New Mexico, we're very budget conscious at that particular point in time. And my partner and I, my male partner and I, had some interviews to do on the Indian reservations. So one of the hotels that we could afford that was within the Bureau budget was, I mean, there were cockroaches in it. It smelled badly, let's just put it that way. I thought, no, I just can't do that. So I ended up sleeping in my Bureau car. I think to not be heavily disturbed by these things or go crazy yourself, I know I had to have what I refer to as a clinical detachment. I can make it analogous to a doctor, like oncologists, surgeons, people that have to give bad news to somebody. If they broke down every time they did that, they wouldn't be effective in their job. So I would compartmentalize what was being said to me. And so I would do the job, and then later it would affect me and impact me. One of the more memorable things about working these types of crimes is the smell. And I can remember it from there's a distinct smell in a morgue versus working with a coroner where there has been a lot of blood or a lot of violence to the victims, and then actually at the crime scene itself. At the morgue, what I remember, it's like a smell of formaldehyde. It seems like to me a very uninviting smell, and it's so horrific. And the other thing is, I would remember I still had long hair at that time, and I'd smell my hair, and the odor would linger on that. So it was like hair wash, shampoo, shower right away when you got back. The FBI was always of an interest to me, and I was kind of an abnormal child in that I knew at age 13 what I wanted to do. And for two reasons. One, I love this country and that we're a nation of laws and liberties, and I hate bullies. I hate people who take advantage of others and others' vulnerabilities. Thought, how can I marry these two callings? And what can I do? And law enforcement seemed like the natural choice. Well, at the time, and it sounds like I'm 105, the FBI was not hiring women. So I looked at that as good experience in an effort to make me more marketable. I started off initially as a probation officer, and then I worked as a police officer working juvenile cases, and then I joined the FBI through the Los Angeles office and went to Albuquerque, New Mexico as an investigator, Tampa, Florida as an investigator, and then I landed up in the behavioral science unit. Well, there was no welcome wagon for me at the FBI, and I was not wanted there. And there was a stereotype or a bias of what women should be doing, and this was not it. This was their job, their domain, their territory, and that's where I believe I had to work harder to prove myself, that because there was no acceptance at that point in time. I'm not saying that people were sitting on the sidelines, hoping I would fail, but they were certainly not doing anything to mentor or encourage me. Once I got into the FBI, like everybody else, I was what they called a field or street agent, but that's when I knew I wanted to get to Quantico and be a profiler. I had always been interested in working on homicide cases, but serial homicide cases and the psychology and psychopathy that goes with that. Well, there weren't any women in the unit, and so to me it's like, well, why not be the first? So I then became the coordinator in the Tampa office so that I could get as much experience and exposure as possible to the type of work that they would be doing. Well, the behavior science was a little bit out of the mainstream of the FBI, and I had worked with Special Agent Bill Hagmeyer, who was in the unit, and there was no advertising of an opening that was coming up. So he verbally told me, he said, hey, we're going to have an opening in the unit. So I took a day of vacation, and went and interviewed for the position. It started like a typical interview, and it was John Douglas, who was the unit chief at the time, and another agent. And they asked me questions like, what skill sets do you bring to the table? What experience have you had? Then John took, I think it was about 5 8x10 photos looking at bloody, battered bodies and pushed them across the desk to me, but he didn't ask any questions. And so I'm looking at them, and I said, well, what do you want to know? Are you not asking me anything? And he goes, I know. I'm observing. And he said, I wanted to see if you had a reaction, like if you'd have a gag reaction, a gasp, if you'd look away, if, you know. And I said, well, why would I do that? And he said, well, we've interviewed some other females, and that's been their reaction. I said, well, I did some research, and you were in the military, I believe the Air Force, and you were like a tennis or a golf instructor, so why would that make you more qualified than me? Now, that was not a good interview strategy, and I do not recommend it, but to his credit, he laughed. So I was hired, I believe, maybe 3 or 4 days after that interview, and was very grateful that John took a chance on me. I think there were a lot of advantages to being a woman in the FBI at that point in time. There are cases, especially when you're dealing with female victims, witnesses, and a few offenders. So depending on the nature of the case, especially if you're getting into like a sexual assault or even some of the homicide cases, women were much more likely to speak to me than they would be to some of my male counterparts. I eventually stepped away from profiling because actually my husband noticed it in me first, and then I also recognized that I'd kind of gone to the dark side. It became a little more depressing. But after looking at, again, on a daily basis, all of these crimes, and very vivid, I started to go into a dark place about human nature. I began to look at all human nature as bad, as negative. So it became just something to me that was like a cloud or an anvil hanging over. So I thought, while Dale was gone, I had been working several cases where a knife was involved. They were all stabbing victims, and all of them, the offender had come in and used their own knives, the victim's knives. And so I thought, aha, somebody breaks in here, they're not going to use our knives, they're going to have to bring their own knife. So I took all of our knives and put them downstairs in the dryer. And then I was off interviewing some female prisoners. My husband Dale comes home. He wanted a knife to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. He calls me and said, where are our utensils? I told him, and he said, I think we need to talk when you come home. So I thought it would be healthier and better to get above ground and get some perspective back. Well, after I transferred out of the profiling unit, I had the great opportunity. I went up the ranks of the FBI. After the 9/11 attacks, the FBI did not have a cyber division. They had cyber entities, agents in each office, but not a program or a division. So my remit, if you will, was to start that. I went into leadership, and I did touch base with all of the different positions you're supposed to. So I was a supervisor in the San Diego office of white-collar crime and financial institution fraud, public corruption. I became an assistant special agent in charge in Denver over all of the criminal and terrorism. I became the special agent in charge, in charge of the office for Los Angeles, before being sent back to Washington, D.C. to be the assistant director of the cyber division. And then I ended my career as the special agent in charge of Phoenix. So I wrote a book. It's a memoir, and it's called Hearts of Darkness. It's basically my memoir, but it predominantly focuses not only on my time in the FBI, but in the behavioral science unit. Profiling was initially created, and it was very rudimentary at the time. Howard Teeton had a psychology background, and he was interested in some of the behaviors of crime, again, not just forensics. And that kind of grew and transitioned. It was about 1972 that it started, but it was very small and very preliminary at that point in time. The founders of the profiling unit were Howard Teeton, John Douglas, and Bob Ressler. I did not know Howard, but I worked with and for both Bob Ressler and John Douglas. John Douglas was my unit chief. He hired me and then was my supervisor, my boss, my entire time there. The behavioral science unit, then to the behavioral analysis unit, was still 12 people when I left. A few years after that, it expanded and became 4 separate units. The behavioral analysis unit stayed the same, but then there was crimes against children, and there was still the training unit, and then another one that actually helped more with terrorism. Because you figure after the 9/11 attacks, that fundamentally changed all of law enforcement. The crime classification, where criminal had been the number one for years and years and years, went to number 8. And you had terrorism and cyber, those sorts of things that were, at the top tier. So the unit was designed to help with counterintelligence and terrorism. I think that originally the word science had that connotation almost like, evidence, right? That if it's a science, then that's an absolute. And the cautionary statement then was about that is it's not an absolute. Again, it's an investigative tool. And the danger was that you would get investigative tunnel vision because investigators would hear, oh, this, or, somebody looks like this, or so that they would exclude looking at others because this is what the science said on something like that. The Richard Jewell case, July 1996, is an example of one of those because he fit the profile. So if you will, they were looking for, this is the bomb that went off in the park at the Olympics. And it's like, okay, he's going to be, a loner, went through all of these things. And he showed up there and he was trying to be helpful. A lot of times you'd see someone that they want to see what the chaos that they've created, right? So they will show up at the crime scene. So he fit all of these things that the profilers were saying that he would. And that was what the example where then they focused on him at the exclusion of other people, and it ended up that he was not responsible for that. Remember, my husband, he was on HRT, they were there at the time. And then he was the one that led the effort that caught Eric Rudolph, who was the bomber. I think the future is actually very encouraging for profiling. And the reason is, as I mentioned previously, there tends to be more collaboration now with other agencies, other technologies, and I think AI is going to be transformative for a lot of things, but sticking with the law enforcement piece of it because it's such a valuable tool. But again, the operative word is tool. And I think it's not going to replace good investigators and people, but it's going to assist in something like that. I remember when DNA came at my time, and it was so exciting. I actually remember I was working on a case with a colleague by the name of Steve Mardigian. And one of the cases that he had, it was an old case that had gone cold. And fortunately, the officers or agents who had preserved the evidence had done it properly. That's why it's so important to preserve it that way. And they could take that old evidence, and with the DNA, they ended up finding the offender. And it was one of the ones that they had interviewed initially early on. And of course, geez, surprise, he lied. But there was no other corroborating evidence at the time. AI, if you look at its capabilities right now and its predictive capabilities, it's amazing. However, there's an old movie called The Minority Report, and I reflect back on that, again, for the cautionary statements on this. I think at this point in time, who knows what it's going to transition into, but you've got to have human oversight and involvement for something like that because you can't replace that at this time, and it is an assist, not a replacement. Serial killers, it seems like it's almost been superseded by active shooter, which has become so prevalent right now, which is very sad. But there's so many different active shooter cases, and they're very different. If you look at the motivations, you cannot make it analogous to a serial killer case versus an active shooter. But I do think serial killing has been shadowed, and part of that has been because of the technology. It's much more difficult to evade now than it had been, and for numerous reasons. I think it's going to become more and more difficult for serial killers to actually evade arrest. Reflecting back on my time in the behavioral science unit, I wouldn't trade it for anything. The way I feel about humanity these days, I've seen the egregious evil of the few. I've learned to recognize the good of the many. When I stopped doing some of the profiling work and was working with, ordinary people, it warmed my heart to be reintroduced and remember how good people can be. And again, we're all just people, right? But I started looking for and finding the good qualities in people. But I also know that there's the good part too.
Hi, I'm a producer on How Crime Works. If you enjoyed this video, then please subscribe and comment below with more ideas of topics you'd like us to cover in this series.